He was just an old man caught stealing a loaf of bread. To the world, he was another homeless face on the street, invisible, forgotten. But in a single moment, a name spoken in a courtroom unlocked a buried past. A past of sacrifice, of heroism, of a man who once saved lives on a battlefield. What happens when a nation forgets its heroes, and then suddenly remembers? This is not just a story of justice delayed. It's a story of dignity restored, of one man's quiet strength, and the ripple effect of kindness that refuses to stay buried. Walter Grady, 66, was a fixture in the Brooklyn neighborhood where he'd been homeless for over a decade. Thin and weathered with a silver beard that hadn't seen proper grooming in years, he carried an old military-style backpack everywhere, faded green canvas with frayed straps that had once been regulation issue. The locals knew him as the quiet one. Unlike other homeless individuals who asked for money or created disturbances, Walter kept to himself. He collected bottles for recycling, occasionally accepted leftovers from sympathetic restaurant workers, and slept in different doorways to avoid becoming a nuisance to any single business owner. What few people knew was that Walter had served in the U.S. Army for over 20 years, honorably discharged in 2004. After his wife Margaret died from cancer in 2008, a disease the VA hospital had initially misdiagnosed, Walter spiraled into depression. He rejected help from family, sold their modest apartment, gave the money to his wife's favorite charity, and disappeared into the anonymous streets of New York. Sometimes it's easier to be nobody than somebody who failed the person they love most, he once told a volunteer at a soup kitchen. On a brutally cold November afternoon, with temperatures dropping below freezing and snow threatening, Walter ducked into Morelli's corner market. He'd gone 3 days without eating, and his hands trembled as he slipped a day-old loaf of bread into his coat, while Mr. Morelli was helping another customer. But Mr. Morelli had installed new security mirrors. "Hey! Stop right there!" he shouted, already reaching for the phone. "I'm calling the cops." Walter didn't run. He simply stood there, the bread still visible in his partially zipped jacket. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he said quietly. 2 patrol officers arrived within minutes. The younger one, Officer Jenkins, seemed uncomfortable as he placed handcuffs on the elderly man's thin wrists. "You really a vet?" Jenkins asked, noticing a dog tag chain around Walter's neck. "This ID is pretty worn out." Walter nodded. "I used to be someone useful. Not anymore." "Gotta take you in, sir," Jenkins said apologetically. "Store owner's pressing charges. Says you've been caught shoplifting before." At the precinct, Walter was processed like any other petty thief. A public defender briefly met with him but seemed more focused on clearing cases than understanding his client. Walter was assigned a court date for the following morning, a preliminary hearing where he'd be formally charged. When morning came, Walter was escorted into Brooklyn's municipal courtroom, still wearing the same clothes from yesterday, now wrinkled from a night in holding. No family members waited in the audience. No character witnesses prepared to vouch for him. Just a scattering of lawyers, reporters covering more significant cases, and court employees going through their daily routines. Case number 47,293, State vs. Walter Grady. The clerk announced monotonously. The young prosecutor stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a loaf of bread from the local market." Given his prior incidents of petty theft and lack of fixed address, we recommend continued detention until trial. The judge, Honorable Michael Carmichael, a stern man known for his no-nonsense approach and swift judgments, glanced down at the case file, barely acknowledging Walter's presence. The courtroom attendees had already mentally dismissed the case, just another homeless person cycling through the system. "Mr. Grady, how do you plead?" Judge Carmichael asked, finally looking up. "Guilty, Your Honor," Walter replied softly. "I was hungry." Someone in the back row snickered. The judge shot a glare in that direction before returning his attention to the paperwork. Walter Edward Grady, former Staff Sergeant, United States Army. Judge Carmichael's voice trailed off as he read the identification details. The courtroom fell silent as the judge's expression transformed. His hand, gripping the edge of the bench, turned white at the knuckles. He stared at Walter, then back at the file, then at Walter again. Without explanation, Judge Carmichael abruptly stood. The entire courtroom froze in confusion. Judges rarely stand during routine hearings. For several long seconds, he remained silent, his face a mask of controlled emotion. "Your Honor?" the prosecutor ventured, uncertain what protocol applied when a judge suddenly stood without declaring a recess. "Court will take a 15-minute recess," Judge Carmichael announced, his voice uncharacteristically rough. "The defendant will remain." As the judge exited to his chambers, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Walter alone remained still, eyes fixed on the floor, either unaware or unconcerned about the unusual turn of events his name had just triggered. Carmichael pulled a worn photo from his desk drawer, a group of military personnel in desert fatigue standing before a medical tent in Iraq. His hands trembled slightly as he found himself in the picture, 20 years younger, serving as a field medic before pursuing law. And there, standing tall in the back row, was Walter Grady. The judge activated his computer and ran a search through the military database he still had access to from his work with Veteran Affairs. Walter Grady's service record appeared on screen, confirming what the judge already suspected. Staff Sergeant Walter Grady had served 3 tours, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, working in logistics, ensuring supplies reached forward operating bases during the most dangerous phases of both conflicts. He'd received the Bronze Star for valor when his convoy was ambushed in 2003. Instead of seeking cover, Walter had driven a burning supply truck away from wounded personnel, sustaining injuries but saving 17 lives. The file contained a photograph that had once made the front page of the New York Times. Walter carrying an injured Afghan child to a medical helicopter during a humanitarian mission. That image had briefly made him a symbol of American compassion amid warfare before public attention shifted elsewhere. But what truly caught the judge's attention was a mission report from July 2003, classified until recently. During a chaotic evacuation under enemy fire, Walter had carried an injured medic, Private First Class Michael Carmichael, 2 miles to safety despite sustaining shrapnel wounds himself. "My God!" the judge whispered. "It's him." Judge Carmichael had spent years trying to locate the man who saved his life, but Walter had disappeared into civilian life, leaving no forwarding address after his discharge. The judge had never even known his rescuer's full name, just Grady, shouted across the chaos of battle. While the judge processed this discovery, Walter sat alone in the courtroom, ignored by the bailiff who checked his phone during the recess. For 15 years Walter had lived on society's margins, invisible to the system he once served. After his wife died, Walter had spiraled into profound grief, compounded by untreated PTSD. The VA hospital's misdiagnosis of Margaret's cancer had destroyed his faith in the system. When she passed, he'd walked away from everything: his benefits, his pension, his identity. He couldn't bear the bureaucracy that had failed the person he loved most. For years, local residents had treated him as a nuisance. Teenagers occasionally threw food at him for amusement. Shop owners hosed down sidewalks where he slept. Police moved him along when residents complained. Even other homeless individuals kept their distance from the quiet man who sometimes woke screaming from nightmares. Walter survived by collecting bottles and cans, earning just enough to buy cough medicine when the winter cold settled in his lungs. He never panhandled, never asked for help. His military training had instilled self-reliance that persisted even as his circumstances deteriorated. On his darkest days, Walter would take out the photo of Margaret he kept wrapped in plastic, protected from the elements. "Almost there, Maggie," he would whisper. "Just holding on a little longer." Back in his chambers, Judge Carmichael made a series of urgent phone calls. First to the VA office, requesting immediate verification of Walter's service record. Then to James Mason, now a colonel, who had served alongside both men years ago. "Mason, it's Michael Carmichael. I found him, the man who pulled me out at Fallujah. He's in my courtroom right now. Homeless. charged with stealing bread. The silence on the other end spoke volumes before Mason responded. I'm 3 hours away. Don't let him leave. The judge wrote a personal note on official letterhead. Walter Grady is not an ordinary homeless man. He is a symbol of loyalty, forgotten by the country he served. Judicial ethics prevented him from dismissing the case outright based on personal connection, but nothing would stop him from ensuring justice took a different path than initially planned. As the recess neared its end, the judge's clerk noticed a document on her desk that hadn't been there before. The famous photograph of Walter with the Afghan child and a handwritten note beneath it. Some heroes never asked to be remembered. The clerk recognized the handwriting as Colonel Mason's from previous correspondence with the Court on Veteran Affairs. The connection was becoming clear. Walter Grady wasn't just any defendant. He was someone whose actions had rippled through many lives, including those who now held power over his fate. When court resumed, Walter noticed the change immediately. The judge's demeanor had transformed, the professional detachment replaced by something Walter couldn't quite identify: respect. Recognition. Before Walter could process this shift, the proceedings took an unexpected turn. In light of new information regarding the defendant's background, this court will postpone further proceedings pending a full investigation, Judge Carmichael announced. The defendant will be remanded to custody until tomorrow's hearing. The prosecutor looked confused but didn't object. Walter, accustomed to systems making decisions about him without explanation, simply nodded. As Walter was led away, Judge Carmichael added, "And see that Mr. Grady receives a proper meal and medical attention." That evening, a local news blog ran a skeptical headline: Homeless man claims military hero status. Judge delays sentencing for bread thief. The comment section filled with cynical takes. Another street person making up stories about being a vet. If he really served, why doesn't he get VA benefits instead of stealing? In the county holding facility, Walter encountered hostility from a young inmate who'd read the article on a contraband phone. "Stolen valor is disgusting, old man," he spat, shoving Walter against the wall. "My brother died in Afghanistan while fakes like you used the uniform to get sympathy." Walter didn't fight back. He simply absorbed the blow, the same way he'd absorbed society's indifference for years. That night, he didn't eat the meal provided. He just clutched his military ID tags and Margaret's photo, wondering why, after all this time, someone had looked at him and actually seen him. Have you ever witnessed someone being misjudged based solely on appearances? Share that story. Someone might need to hear it. The next morning, Walter was escorted back to the courtroom, unaware that something extraordinary was unfolding. Unlike the previous day's nearly empty gallery, today every seat was filled. News cameras waited outside, forbidden from entering, but eager to capture whatever would follow. Walter's confusion deepened when he noticed his public defender had been replaced by a distinguished older attorney who introduced himself as Richard Harlow from the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. "Someone's taken an interest in your case, Mr. Grady," Harlow explained, offering no further details. As Walter took his seat at the defense table, he heard the courtroom doors open. The audience rose as Judge Carmichael entered, but Walter's attention was drawn to 3 military officers in full-dress uniforms who had entered behind the court. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Michael Carmichael," the bailiff announced. The proceedings began with unusual formality, the judge's demeanor markedly different from the previous day. "Before we address the charges against Mr. Grady, the court will hear relevant testimony pertaining to the defendant's background, which may influence these proceedings." Walter stared in confusion as Colonel James Mason approached the witness stand. Though 20 years older than when Walter had last seen him, Mason's military bearing remained unmistakable. After being sworn in, Mason addressed the court with practiced precision. "I am Colonel James Mason, currently stationed at Fort Hamilton. I have known the defendant, Staff Sergeant Walter Grady, since our deployment to Iraq in 2003. The colonel turned to face Walter directly. "This man before you saved the lives of 17 soldiers when our convoy was ambushed near Fallujah. While under heavy fire, he drove a burning fuel truck away from our position, sustaining second-degree burns but preventing an explosion that would have killed us all. Murmurs spread through the courtroom as Mason continued. Staff Sergeant Grady later carried a wounded medic, a young private first class named Michael Carmichael, 2 miles to safety, despite shrapnel wounds to his own leg. At this revelation, all eyes turned to Judge Carmichael, whose professional composure momentarily cracked as he nodded in confirmation. The prosecutor stood, clearly uncomfortable. Your Honor, while this testimony speaks to the defendant's past character, it doesn't change the fact that he committed theft. If I may continue. Colonel Mason interrupted. After reviewing Mr. Grady's file, we've discovered a significant administrative error. Due to a system migration in 2008, Walter Grady's pension and benefits were erroneously terminated when he didn't respond to paperwork sent to an outdated address. He has been entitled to approximately $1,370 per month for the past 15 years, plus medical care for service-related injuries. That totals over $246,000 in unpaid benefits. The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Walter himself looked stunned, his weathered hands gripping the table edge. Furthermore, Mason added, producing a folder, we have affidavits from 5 members of your old unit, all attesting to your character and service, including this letter from General Richards, who credits you with saving his son. During that same ambush, Judge Carmichael addressed Walter directly for the first time. Mr. Grady, would you please approach the bench? As Walter stood uncertainly, the judge continued. Protocol would typically prevent me from presiding over a case involving someone with whom I have a personal connection. However, I did not recognize you yesterday, and only after reviewing your file did I realize you were the man who saved my life in Iraq. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The judge removed his glasses, his formal demeanor softening. I've spent nearly 2 decades trying to locate you to thank you. I never knew your full name, just Grady, shouted across the battlefield. Walter's voice, when he finally spoke, was rough from disuse. I was just doing my job, sir. You did far more than your job. The judge responded. And this country has failed to do its job for you. Judge Carmichael turned to the prosecutor. In light of these extraordinary circumstances, does the state wish to proceed with charges? The young prosecutor, now visibly moved, stood. Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Grady, with prejudice. So ordered. The judge responded immediately. Mr. Grady, you are free to go. This court extends its deepest apologies for the miscarriage of justice that has extended far beyond these proceedings. As Walter stood in shocked silence, the back doors of the courtroom opened again. A woman in her 30s entered, her eyes searching until they found Walter. She approached slowly, tears streaming down her face. Uncle Walter, she said. I'm Rebecca, Margaret's niece. We've been looking for you for years. Walter's composure finally broke. His shoulders sagged as Rebecca embraced him, the first human contact he'd experienced in years that wasn't from police officers placing him in handcuffs. Outside the courtroom, reporters thrust microphones toward Colonel Mason. This is not just about one veteran, he stated firmly. This is about thousands of Walter Gradys who fall through cracks in a system they defended. Today we begin making this right. By afternoon, the story had gone viral. News helicopters hovered over the courthouse as Walter emerged, clean-shaven and wearing donated clothes, flanked by Colonel Mason and Judge Carmichael, now recused from the case but present as a private citizen. Mr. Morelli, the store owner who had pressed charges, pushed through reporters to reach Walter. I didn't know, he said, visibly shaken. I saw you as just another troublemaker. I'm ashamed now. Walter simply nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Within 48 hours, a veterans organization established a fund for Walter that quickly exceeded $200,000 in donations. Social media erupted with similar stories of veterans who had fallen through bureaucratic cracks, prompting the VA to announce a review of terminated benefits cases. In a private moment away from cameras, Judge Carmichael finally had the conversation he'd waited 20 years to have. "You carried me for 2 miles with shrapnel in your leg," he said quietly. "The medics said you refused treatment until they stabilized me." Walter shrugged. "You were worse off than me. You said something to me that day," the judge continued. "When I was going in and out of consciousness, you said, 'Just keep breathing, kid. Your story isn't over.' Those words kept me alive. Kept me fighting. I became a judge because I wanted to continue serving, like you did." Walter looked at the judge, no longer seeing the authority figure in robes, but the scared young medic from his memories. "I'm glad something good came from that day." "Not just something good," the judge replied. "Everything good in my life since then. My career. My family. My chance to make a difference. It all exists because you didn't leave me behind." For the first time in years, Walter smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "No man left behind," that wasn't just a saying for me. 3 days later, Walter stood in the judge's chambers wearing a new suit, his military decorations finally displayed on his chest. The Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and other ribbons told the story of his service. A Veterans Affairs representative formally presented him with his back benefits, in an additional settlement for the administrative error. As cameras captured the moment, Walter spoke publicly for the first time. "I don't want anyone's pity. I just hope that those who come after won't be forgotten like I was." The story transformed from a local human interest piece to a national conversation about how America treats its veterans. Legislators cited Walter's case when introducing bills to reform the benefits system. The photograph of Walter carrying the Afghan child circulated again, this time alongside the image of him homeless on Brooklyn streets, a powerful juxtaposition that forced uncomfortable questions about national priorities. Walter Grady, who had been invisible for 15 years, had suddenly become impossible to ignore. What was a moment when you saw justice arrive, late but worth the wait? Share your story to give someone else hope. 6 months later, Walter moved into Veterans Village, a supportive housing community in Brooklyn. His small apartment, the first place he could call home since Margaret's death, contained few possessions but featured a wall dedicated to photographs. Margaret on their wedding day, his old unit in Iraq, and a new image of him with Judge Carmichael at a veterans recognition ceremony. Walter declined most interview requests, but agreed to speak at local schools about military service and the challenges veterans face upon returning home. His quiet dignity and straightforward manner resonated, particularly with troubled teenagers, who found in him neither judgment nor condescension, just honest accounts of both heroism and hardship. Each afternoon, Walter could be found at Prospect Park, sitting on a bench watching children play, sometimes the same bench where he had once slept when the weather was too severe for his usual doorways. Outside the Brooklyn courthouse, a new bronze plaque was installed. "Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten." Alongside this inscription stood a relief sculpture depicting Walter carrying the wounded medic, who would become Judge Carmichael, with the American flag as backdrop. During the dedication ceremony, the mayor announced the creation of an annual fund to provide legal assistance specifically for homeless veterans, named the Grady Initiative. A 10-year-old boy, who had often seen Walter collecting bottles, wrote an essay for his school newspaper. "Not everyone in torn clothes is bad. Some people wear memories instead." The essay won a citywide competition and was read aloud at a city council meeting addressing homelessness policy. Walter maintained a friendship with Judge Carmichael, occasionally joining his family for Sunday dinners. During one such evening, the judge's son asked Walter if he was angry about being homeless for so long. Walter considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't need anyone's pity. I just hope those who come after will remember those who came before." On Veterans Day, Walter stood before a crowd at Fort Hamilton, wearing his dress uniform for the first time in decades. When asked to make remarks, he spoke briefly but powerfully. "I once protected this country. Now the country has protected me back." His voice strengthened as he continued. "Kindness is never too late, it just needs someone patient enough to wait for it." As he stepped down from the podium, the assembled military personnel, from young recruits to aging veterans, rose in silent salute. Walter straightened his posture and returned the gesture, his eyes clear and dignified. No longer looking down at the ground, but forward, toward the future. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Don't give up when you're doing what's right. What moment have you stood firm when the world stood against you? Share it now. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories to see that truth and justice ultimately prevail. Share this video with someone who needs faith in doing the right thing. Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a loaf of bread from the local market. The prosecutor stated coldly. The man only bowed his head. I just needed strength to live one more day. The courtroom chuckled, but the judge didn't. He had just heard the man's name. Who was he? And why did the judge's eyes suddenly fill with tears?